Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Beatriz Cantada. I'm the Director of Engagement for Diversity and Inclusion in the Institute Community and Equity Office at MIT. Welcome. Before we begin with our presentation, I do want to share some acknowledgments. So I'd like to thank my programming team, Paulina Wolf, Alejandro Ramos, Molly McInerney, and Richard from AV. And because of them, we're able to provide food and a hybrid environment so we can all join in person and virtually. So thank you to my programming team. I'd like to thank the senior leadership support. That would be Provost Cindy Barnhart, former Interim Institute Community Equity Officer and Professor Dan Hastings. And we recently hired our new head of our office, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Carl Reed, who couldn't join us today, but we will be seeing him soon in future presentations. I'd like to thank our colleagues from Lincoln Lab who are joining us virtually. Our speakers, faculty hosts, John Fernandez, who's here joining us in person, James Phillip Thompson from DUSP, and colleagues from ESI. If they're here virtually or in person, please raise your hand. Thank you again for supporting our presenter. So I also want to acknowledge our current scholars who are also joining us virtually and in person. We have Jean-Luc Pierit, Tawana Dillahunt, I believe Angelina Viceza, Christine Taylor Butler, and Denise Frazier are joining us virtually. So hello and welcome. Note we will be recording this session. Friendly reminder, please stay muted during the presentation and live captioning is available. Again, for those joining us virtually, lunch is on us. Paulina Wolf will post an Uber Eats voucher for you to use within the next 3 business days. Subscribe to our newsletter, ico.mit.edu, if you'd like to hear more about events and future presentations with our MLK scholars. Our next event will be on April 9th. That is a Tuesday with Denise Frazier. Now about our presenter, Angélica María Mayolo Obregón. Oh, before we do have a special guest. I'd like to acknowledge our presenter's mother, who is joining us all the way from Colombia. She's joining us in person, and someone else raised their hand. Please tell me, are you a family member? Oh, okay. Well, welcome. Merlin Obregón. So thank you for joining us. Bienvenido a los Estados Unidos. So about our presenter, Angélica María Mayolo Obregón is former Minister of Culture of Colombia, where she also formerly served as Executive President of the Chamber of Commerce in Buenaventura. She holds a bachelor's in administrative law from Pontificia Universidad Javeriana Cali and a master's in international law from UCLA. Obregón specializes in administrative law with knowledge and experience in economic development, cultural and creative industries, sustainability, international cooperation, and high-impact projects in vulnerable populations. Her honors include the 2019 Policarpa Salvarrieta Medal, awarded by the Congress of the Republic of Colombia in recognition of her work to advance women's equality and economic empowerment. Obregón is currently a consultant for the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Angélica to the podium.
Thank you, Beatriz, for the introduction and for all the support during the MLK program. And I want to thank Professor John Fernandez for being here and for the work that we have done together from the Environmental Solution Initiative. As Beatriz mentioned, and Angélica Mayolo. To start my presentation, I want to speak a little bit about my journey. So I was born in Buenaventura, Colombia. This is a small town in the Pacific coast that concentrates the highest population of Afro-descendants in our country. Just to give you an example, the Black communities in Colombia are 10% of the entire population, and we had in Buenaventura at least 85% of the people is Black. Growing up in Buenaventura makes me conscious about some development gaps that we have from the Afro-descendant communities compared to the rest of the country. And I realized since I was a child that our real richness was in our biodiversity and culture. And that's why I dedicated my life to work to preserve biodiversity, cultural heritage, but also to identify opportunities for economic development for disadvantaged communities, mostly for Afro-descendants. most of my life I have been working in the public sector in Colombia, and I had the opportunity to have my first decision-making position at head of the International Affairs Office at the Ministry of Environment in the country, where I had the opportunity to represent Colombia in many environmental scenarios, like the Climate Change COP, like the Biodiversity COP, but also to work in government makes me feel how difficult it is to make changes in disadvantaged communities, but also how difficult it is to create opportunities for communities that live in biodiversity hotspot. And I want to speak about that because after that, I had the opportunity to be appointed Minister of Culture, and I understand the necessity to connect the policies to biodiversity preservation with cultural preservation, because local communities in Latin America has been working for many years to preserve natural resources as a cultural practices, but they don't have been recognized, especially for Black communities. It has been very well recognized for indigenous people, but not for Black communities. And this is why I decided to apply for the MLK program to continue a project that was developed by a former MLK fellow, Luis Gilberto Murillo, who was Minister of Environment in Colombia. So how was the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change created? So it was an initiative led by Luis Gilberto Murillo when he was MLK visiting scholar, and it was launched at the Climate Change COP 26 in Glasgow. And it was conceived with the goal of acknowledging and celebrating the efforts and contributions of Black communities in safeguarding biodiversity and natural resources in the Americas. As I was explaining to you, there is a huge recognition of the contribution of indigenous peoples in the region in terms of preserving natural resources. But Afro-descendant communities in the Americas also has played a key role defending natural resources, but it hasn't been recognized in many aspects, not in public policies in some countries, but most importantly, we didn't have research that allow us to have real data that demonstrate the contribution of Afro-descendants in preserving natural resources. So this is the spirit of the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change, which is the focus of my fellowship here. So what is the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change? This is a collective effort to elevate the expertise and perspective of Afro-descendant populations in relation to climate change mitigation and adaptation throughout the Americas. And what we want to achieve, we want to acknowledge the critical need for greater visibility to the challenge of Afro-descendant communities face in addressing significant environmental issues, including climate risk, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem degradation. But also, most importantly, we want to document and highlight the role of Afro-descendant communities as a successful stewards of environmental resources. We want to strengthen local capacity and provide not only financial resources, but also technical capacity for Afro-descendant communities to engage in these works via research and community innovation projects, which is so important. We want to become an international network of researchers, policymakers, and environmental leaders to influence policies and major decisions at the international, national, and regional levels. So part of my work, how we have been defining the lines of work of the forum and what are the pillars of the forum. So we define the forum as this collective effort focused on research, participation and visibility, and local engagement and innovation to foster the capacities of Afro-descendant communities to face their main environmental challenges. So in terms of research, that has been the focus of our work. We really want to map and evaluate climate contributions as well as the impact of climate change on the people of African descendants in the Americas. But also we want to identify and document what are the best practices that those communities has been implemented in terms of natural climate solutions and the relation of those practices with cultural heritage. And also, what we discover is we need to involve more Afro-descendant researchers in participatory research process that includes not only scientists, but also traditional knowledge from local communities. And in terms of participation of visibility, we identify that we don't have the voices of Afro-descendant communities in the main environmental decision-making processes. When we see, just to give you an example, the delegation of Brazil in the climate change COP, we don't see Black people in those delegations, even when Brazil have more than 50% of their population Black. We don't see Afro-Colombians in their delegations. So we're starting elevating the voices of Afro-descendant leaders in those main environmental decision-making scenarios to guarantee the perspective of those communities in these dialogues or debate. And in terms of local engagement and innovation, we really are working in mobilized technical assistance to contribute in the design, formulation, and implementation of community-led natural climate solution projects. So what are some of the advancements that we have that I want to share with you all? So first, in terms of research, we start mapping the Afro-descendant peoples and their environmental conditions in the Americas. So for this work, we, from the team of the Environmental Solution Initiative, we started reviewing census of 46 countries in the Americas to identify political and administrative information of the country by different levels, the local level, the regional levels, geographic database of these 46 countries in the region, also statistical reports and environmental academic documents to identify. First, something what is very controversial, because depend on the self-determination condition of each country, is what is the estimation of Afro-descendant population in the Americas? Because there are very controversial data from the national census because of the lack of self-recognition from many communities. What is the characterization of collective territories title? As you know, some of the Latin American countries have recognized collective lands for indigenous people because of their environmental goals, but also the cultural heritage. It happened also with some Latin American countries for Black people. Colombia, Brazil, Suriname, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Honduras has recognized land titles for Black people, a sense of reparations from slavery, but also to recognize their contribution for environmental goals. And we also were evaluating endemic species in Afro-descendant territories, carbon sequestration in Afro-descendant territories, and deforestation rates. And I want to show you just some of the findings that we have. This map is the overlap between the presence of Afro-descendant communities in the Americas and some of the environmental mechanisms. First, we identified that at least 179 million people in the Americas has self-recognized as Afro-descendants, which is a huge number. It's more than the population of Mexico, just to give you an example. And something that is very special is that there is a clear overlap between the presence of Afro-descendant communities in the Americas and the biodiversity hotspot and other important natural areas that we need to preserve in order to continue having a massive presence of natural resources. So it means that the presence of Afro-descendants in those territories is very important to preserve one of the most strategic ecosystems in the regions, especially in the Caribbean, especially in the Amazon region, but also in the region called the Chocó Biogeographic region. I don't know if I can. There is a possibility to use a light to, no? Yes. Yeah, it's a little weak. Right here? Okay, that's perfect. So from Panama to Peru is the Chocó Biogeographic region, one of the highest endemisms in the world. As you know, the Amazon region, which is very important in terms of the environmental strategic ecosystem, but also the Caribbean, which is the highest presence of Afro-descendant communities. So there is a significant overlap between Afro-descendant communities and areas of highly valuable natural resources. This includes biodiversity hotspot, protected natural reserve, carbon-rich ecosystem, primarily tropical forests and mangroves. And some countries has advanced in the recognition of land titles, especially Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Suriname, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And those territories settled by Afro-descendant communities also face the highest rates of poverty in the region. That makes definitely, that creates a condition that generates a pressure over natural resources because of the lack of economic opportunity for local communities. So part of the work, we have been working with different partners. One of them is Conservation International. And from the work with Conservation International, from the forum, we had identified some data about the deforestation rates, what have demonstrated that lands that had been titled for Afro-descendant community had the possibility to preserve more natural resources than similar lands that have other type of environmental mechanisms protection, which is very important because the lighter blue represent the forest loss in areas that are preserved by Afro-descendant communities. And the dark blue represent the forest loss in the area that have other type of mechanism for protection, which means that Black communities in Latin America that have land title has made a great work preserving natural resources because the deforestation rate is lower in the territories preserved by Afro-descendant communities than territories that has been recognized with a different kind of protection. We're working in two research papers right now. One of these is the participation of ethnic communities in Colombian carbon market. And why we are researching about carbon market? Because what happened because of the land title for ethnic communities in Latin America is because the ethnic communities became a main player in the carbon market. Why? Because they have the extension of lands required to have a red blood project. But what is very important in our research, most of the research has been focused to evaluate the ways as the environmental goals have been defined in carbon sequestration. But no one was researching about if these projects are having a real positive impact in ethnic communities in terms of fulfilling the sustainable development goals. So our work is focused on understanding if the carbon market projects are effectively fostering equitable participation of ethnic communities in the market, but also if they are facilitating the sustainable development goals achievement, and if they are now promoting climate justice. So we're working in that research with the support of WWF Brazil and Colombia. And our goal is to formulate actionable recommendations for governments, the private sector, the communities to enhance the equitable and effective engagement of ethnic communities in the voluntary carbon market. So we had a very comprehensive methodology that worked with documental analysis, spatial data analysis, conflict analysis, communities participation, and governance analysis. And our interest is to evaluate the value chain of the carbon market because carbon market will play a key role in terms of the condition that the Latin American countries have defined to fulfill the climate change goals. But it requires the involvement of local communities. And our recommendation, what we really want to guarantee is that carbon markets doesn't became an instrument to destroy the local community rights and benefit private companies. We are developing those type of projects in collecting land rights. So we're very advanced in our paper. We hope to have ready in 2 months the paper, and we have some important findings from this. One of these is that is very important to strengthening the governance of ethnic communities for effective participation in the voluntary carbon markets, especially how we should prepare local communities to understand better the market, but also to understand themselves as a key partner of the carbon in terms of how the work that they have been done should be compensated in terms of economic development, but also how those communities should invest the revenue that they obtain from the carbon market to guarantee that their next generation continue having cultural practices that allow to preserve environment. And the second paper is a paper focused in a region called the Biogeographic Chocó, which is a paper that intends to present a prioritized action needed to protect this biodiversity hotspot. Why this biodiversity hotspot is so important? What is the relation of this biodiversity hotspot with the US? So this is a neotropical corridor that started in Costa Rica and finished in the northern of Peru with more than 180,000 kilometers. But it's the highest endemism on the planet. 25% of the species that we find in the Chocó biogeographic, we don't find it in other part of the world, especially amphibians and birds. And most of those amphibians has been used for research to create new medicine for cancers, from different type of cancers. And one of the highest rainfall rates on the planet also, that means that we have concentration of water in this ecosystem, high carbon capture in tropical forests and mangroves in this ecosystem, but something which is very important in terms to identify the socioeconomic pressures over biodiversity that I was mentioned to you. Because we have in the Chocó biogeographic region, the highest concentration of illegal mining, more than 30,000 hectares disgreed between 2018 and 2022, but also the highest concentration of illicit crops in the Americas, more than 85,000 hectares, mainly in Colombia and Ecuador. And it has a close relationship with the economic relation with the US and Europe, because unfortunately, most of these illicit gold came from the US or to Europe, but also most of the illicit crops came from the market of third-class countries. So another important thing of this ecosystem is because the intensive loss of biodiversity has a close relation with the migratory crisis in the Darien Gap. Have you guys heard about the migratory crisis in the Darien Gap? Yeah, more than 700 people crossing into the US since 2021 from this ecosystem. And we all has been speaking about the humanitarian crisis, but no one is talking about the environmental crisis from this migratory crisis. So in this paper, as I mentioned, we want to propose the creation of a transnational binding mechanism that articulates all government conservation efforts within the region. Because what is happening now is we have bilateral relations between Colombia and Ecuador, Colombia and Panama, Panama and Ecuador, but we don't have a real mechanism able to combine the effort between all of the countries to guarantee a more strategic efforts to preserve natural resources, but also to improve the economic condition of local communities. Because if we don't have sustainable business, a sustainable model that guarantee that the community who live in the Chocó biographic region are able to have better quality of life, we will have continue having a pressure over the natural resources because of the illegal mining, because of the illicit crop, because of the migratory crisis. So we have a lot of expectation with this paper. We want to have it ready for the biodiversity COP16, and we see this paper will be open the opportunity to have a more deep discussion between the countries involved in the Chocó biogeographic region. So the second line of work is participation and visibility. In terms of participation and visibility, as I mentioned, we are influencing governments to have representation of Afro-descendant communities in their delegation, but also elevating the voices of Afro-descendant environmental leaders in the decision-making environmental scenarios. So we have participated during the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, which was our first participation, having local leaders from Panama, Honduras, and Colombia, with several leaders from the Americas and the Caribbean presenting the vision of them about climate change, In the Finance in Common, we was an event that unified effort from different banks of the world that are working in environmental finance. And we also want to have the voices of local communities speaking about how to finance sustainable projects in collective lands, not only for Afro-descendant, but also for indigenous people. We participate in the Climate Change COP 28 in Dubai, presenting the results that I show you from the mapping. And we are going to participate this year in the Biodiversity COP 16 in Cali, where we provide technical advisory to the city and the national government to present to the United Nations Convention the plan of work that we're going to have during this COP 20, during this COP 16, that will have the role of local communities in the center of the discussion about biodiversity protection. And also, we are planning to work in the Afro-descendant Summit during the COP 16 as the opportunity to have a deep analysis about policy that should be created to governments to guarantee the conservation of natural resources in the collective lands that are presented by Afro-descendant communities. In terms of local engagement and innovation, we have been working to consolidate a network that combine organizations from Afro-descendant leaders from different communities, especially grassroots organizations across the Americas, mostly in Colombia, Panama, Honduras, and here in the US, supporting the design and implementation of initiatives from fellow leaders, especially in Colombia. We are right now about to start a project about biodiversity participatory science with youth in Chocó, in Colombia, which will be create a platform to evaluate the state of biodiversity in a town, which is a hotspot, a biodiversity hotspot. And we are working in a proposal with the Inter-American Development Bank to support from the MIT-SI and most specifically for the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change to provide local government capacity buildings to work with cities that are biodiversity hotspot with highest concentration of Afro-descendants in Latin America. Those are our partners. We have built this network. We consider right now the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change a network of networks focused, as I mentioned, on research that we're working from MIT with Conservation International and Universidad Javeriana in Colombia. In terms of participation and visibility, we're working with the government of Colombia, with the Permanent Forum on People of Afro-descendant from the United Nations, with Global Black, and we're working in terms of local engagement and innovation, as I mentioned, with local grassroots organizations in Panama, like Panama Sostenible, in Colombia with Mano Cambiada, ONECA from Honduras, and SUDEC from the US. Our current goals for 2024 and 2025, we want to launch an Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change Research Network because we want to continue creating data that support the results and the contribution of Afro-descendant communities in the climate agenda, and specifically to disseminate knowledge on the strategic role of Afro-descendant communities in the advancement of natural climate solutions, with a focus on climate contributions, biodiversity conservation, bioeconomy, and carbon markets. We hope to launch this network during the COP16. We already have at least 12 researchers from different universities in the region. In terms of participation and visibility, we want to arrange the celebration of the Afro-Descendant Summit during the COP16 to build a declaration for COP on behalf of the Afro-Descendant community, who's became a technical document that serves for the purpose to create new public policies in Latin American governments. And in terms of local engagement and innovation, with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank, we want to create a pipeline of at least 4 projects of community-based natural climate solutions projects with local environmental leaders network. And our work from the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change will be to provide technical assistance and training in the design and formulation of those projects. So I want to finish with this phrase that I was thinking, that the MLK Visiting Scholar and Professor program was the engine that enabled the work of the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change, who has unified the effort of local leaders, researchers, and policymakers. And this impulse continue pushing forward the new generation that will foster climate justice and sustainable development within our communities from the Afro-descendant in the Americas. So thank you all for being here.
So we will be taking questions, comments from those joining us virtually or in person. So I'm just taking a look at those joining us in person. Hands raised if you have any questions, or Angelica, comments, anything virtually too. Paulina, I'll check with you, but I have hands raised here. Wasalu and then Tawana. Tawana.
Thanks, Waslu. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to speaking more afterward. I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the conflict analysis approach that you take, and then how do you facilitate the voices of the local communities, particularly as it relates to participatory science, participatory engagement?
Thank you. So first, about the conflict analysis, as we mentioned, we had identified that we have the highest concentration of Afro-descendant communities in areas we had a highly valuable environmental condition, because they are a biodiversity hotspot or natural protected areas. But at the same time, those are areas without the infrastructure to create economic development. So those communities have the pressure over biodiversity because they are exploiting the natural resources because they don't have other conditions to create economic development. Some part of the solution that we think we should create, combining researchers, policymakers, and environmental leaders, is how to build natural climate solutions that also are able to solve the necessary conditions to protect natural resources, but at the same time to create economic development for local community with different type of projects like natural tourism, that creating the possibility to be able in the carbon market, but with equitable conditions, not in the same that some of the developers are treating local communities. And in the second part of how we are able to elevate the voices of local communities in those decision-making environmental scenarios, we're working with very recognized mangroves organization led by Afro-descendant environmental leaders. So during the mapping, we identify some of those organizations, and we are being provided for their technical capacities to prepare their interventions during the COPs and during the other scenarios.
What are some of the discrete challenges that you face from local communities in the face of the promises of development versus what the cost of that in terms of biodiversity loss of kind of endemic species and stuff like that? What are some of the challenges, the complaints, some of the things that you kind of have to navigate kind of person to person, household to household?
Thank you. I will say the first one could be political will, because ethnic communities in Latin America has been representative in government, but they are not enough influence to guarantee some changes in the local policies. And in terms of political will, there is a necessity to have a clear investment in those territories that concentrate biodiversity. In terms of guaranteeing education, instrument for local community to preserve natural resources, sustainable projects in terms of economic developments, is very difficult to find in Latin American governments that are very committed with the development of local communities in those territories. You find governments interested in to expand natural protected areas, but not necessarily in creating in parallel opportunities for local communities. And the second main challenges will be financial mechanism for collective lands. What happened is you have huge extension of lands recognized for indigenous people and for Afro-descendant communities, but you don't have designed financial mechanisms that allows those communities to create sustainable business in those territories. So in some cases, you have the land, but you don't have the capacity to develop sustainable business in those lands. So you still have landlords with high extension of lands without economic opportunities to develop conditions in those territories.
Before we go to in-person, I do have a question via Zoom. What kinds of partners are you most in need of and looking at this time?
Okay, as I mentioned, we have 3 lines of work. Research, so we want to launch the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change Research Network. So we are looking for Afro-descendant researchers in Latin America and the Caribbean that wants to work in research focused on bioeconomy, climate change, and biodiversity. In terms of participation and visibility, we want to extend our network of local leaders with mangroves organizations that are implementing natural climate solution projects. And in terms of policymakers, we really want to work with people from governments that are working in biodiversity and climate change challenges, but with a focus on preserving the heritage of ethnic communities in terms of biodiversity conservation.
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned in places where ADPs own the land, there was less of a rate of deforestation. Could you explain why you think that is?
There are many reasons, but the first one will be culture, because those communities have some cultural practice that are very focused on preserving natural resources. Just to give you an example, in most of the Afro-descendant communities, they build their house from wood, you know, but they know how to cut the tree, when they should cut the tree, what are the type of tree that can use to build their houses. There are many studies that have demonstrated that some cultural practices from indigenous people and Afro-descendant communities are related with the way that they behave with nature. And they definitely, in their cultural practices, prioritize the preservation of natural resources.
Hello. So you've mentioned a few partners in these projects, the Inter-American Development Bank, USAID, these big companies that set up carbon trading programs. How do some of the communities that you work with feel about these kinds of institutions that are seen as very pro-market, that are seen as like old school development institutions? How does that clash with the way life works in some of these places? And for example, in these agreements, who mediates one of these big carbon capture agreement or REDD+ agreement?
Yeah, just to give you an example, we don't have any alliance with carbon market development projects. So we're not working with private companies. We're just analyzing the cases of the carbon market in Colombia with the participation of local communities. And in terms of the Inter-American Development Bank, we are not working still with them. We just present a proposal and we're waiting for a positive response. And it will be focused on capacity building for local governments, more in the concept of biodiversities and how we support local governments to build local policies in terms of urban planning to preserve natural resources. But just to go deep in your question, I think part of our work from the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change is also to influence those traditional institutions that haven't seen the value of ethnic communities in terms of the environmental agenda. And I said that because the real value to consider ethnic communities a very significant actor in the environmental agenda is more than recognize how well they have preserved natural resources. It had to be with financial mechanisms. And part of the work that we had to do is how we work with the banks, how we work with the financial system to identify new models to finance sustainable projects with local communities. This is a challenge for most of the Latin American countries who have recognized land titles, because they, right now, just to give you the example of Colombia, only a national bank from the Minister of Agriculture is the only one who provides loans for indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. And the capacity of this bank is very reduced according to the necessities of those communities. Part of what we should continue researching in the future is how we create new model for financial mechanism for ethnic communities that allow those communities to implement projects with their vision about natural protection.
Thank you for this talk, and thank you also for doing all this work. This is amazing. I'm really interested in the natural climate solutions, and if you have any data or any sense of like among the things that fall under that umbrella, kind of what are the highest impact types of solutions there?
Yeah, I just want to give an advertisement. So Marcela Angel, he's the one who has been leading with me the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change. She's the director of Natural Climate Solutions at the MIT ESI. She has been working in different ideas about how natural climate solutions are a real solution for environmental challenge in biodiversity hotspot. And if you give me your contact, I'm going to send you some of the information that MIT ESI has been working from the Natural Climate Solution Program.
I wanted to ask, because I see about the illegal mining, the illicit crops in the territories. I'm curious about two things. Number one is the impacts of violence against women when it comes to defending the lands. And then secondly, attitudes of the younger generations, like do they feel like they can remain in the collective territories, or is there kind of a need to like go to like the city or something like this?
Thank you for this question, because in the case of Colombia, we have an explosive displacement of the youth from the ethnic communities to the main cities because of security conditions too, not only because of the lack of opportunity, but also because of security opportunities. And the lack of presence of the states providing services in those territories is part of the main reason why they decided to move to the main cities in the country. I don't have data from other countries in Latin America, but just because of the condition of the Black communities in Ecuador, which are just behind to Colombia, is very similar, that there is a massive displacement of ethnic communities from the main cities.
Great, thank you. Actually, I'm going to do two things. One is to answer your question on natural climate solutions. So I'm John Fernandez, the director of the Environmental Solutions Initiative. So we set up the Natural Climate Solutions program 6 or so years ago. The highest priority is to protect natural carbon sinks around the world. We have the real challenge of between now and 2050, adding about 20% to the world population. To be able to feed all those people business as usual, we would have to add something like 600 million hectares of land, which is going to come out of mostly natural, tropical forests and all that. So if we don't, so the highest priority is to protect and to limit deforestation. The highest priority is not to plant trees. To plant trees is a long-term sustainability solution, but it's not going to solve our climate change problem for a variety of reasons, mostly because, well, first of all, trees grow slowly. We need immediate emissions reduction right now. There's also many issues having to do with equity, displacing peoples from lands and then planting a bunch of trees. And there have been a number of really problematic projects doing that. So the highest priority is to protect natural carbon sink and not to release irrecoverable carbon. Irrecoverable carbon, some of you might know, is that carbon which, if released from tropical forests and boreal forests, there's no way we're going to be able to recover that carbon from the atmosphere. It's out there, and it's a huge amount. So hopefully that answered your question to some extent, but still, Marcela would have more to add. So I had a question for Angélica. Have you thought about the role of biodiversity credits? It's an emerging market. It's very small. It has the potential to grow exponentially. And I'm just wondering if you've given that some thought.
Yeah, definitely, John. Part of our discussion with WWF in the project that we are doing now about carbon market in Colombia is that we should have a second research focus on the bonus from biodiversity, because it's a growing market, but maybe because this is a starting point, we can create some recommendation that allow to have a better focus on equitable condition for local communities.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm so proud to hear this talk because I'm from Colombia as well. And it's really nice to see how from MIT, we are sending these messages and protecting biodiversity in our country. One of the main issues, I think, across Colombia is the inequality, the stratification that we have. Even like inside ethnic communities, it's something that is visible. So we could find landlords in the Afro-Colombian community. And how could you ensure that the voices of the more marginalized like people could be heard, right? And that the participation is going to be ensured during this process. And what are the positive outcomes that you see for these specific communities? So just to let you know, in Colombia, we have different, it's called stratos, which means like there are very low-income communities that unfortunately are the ones that benefit the least from all these initiatives. Those voices are not heard. And so how all this amazing initiative is impacting these communities that are the most needed?
It's very challenging, to guarantee that we really are able to identify all of the community that we want to elevate their voices. But in terms of the work of the Afro Inter-American Forum on Climate Change, as I explained, we have been mapping the grassroots organizations that are led by Afro-descendant environmental leaders, not only in Colombia, but also in Latin America. And we have been working with them to support with technical capacities to influence their national agendas, but mostly to guarantee a space of participation in the main decision-making itineraries on the environmental agenda, the climate change COP, and now in the biodiversity COP.
Thank you, everyone. It is 12:55. Any last-minute comments, both virtually or in person, while we have Angélica joining us this afternoon?
This is more like just maybe a bigger like philosophical kind of question that kind of generated us thinking about it. Like kind of like innovation solutions or like development. Is it meant to kind of, because biodiversity as a term like sounds good, like, oh, it's like, yeah, we need to be biodiverse, but that diversity also comes with big swings and like seasonal things and patterns and different stuff, which may not be conducive to like human existence in certain capacities. When you, how can I put this? How much innovation versus like, what's the ratio between like, this is good biodiversity and this is kind of like aspects of biodiversity that are a little, that we would want development to kind of like take the place of or like replace to a certain degree, if that makes any sense. Sorry if it's like jumbled.
Definitely. I mean, we don't want also to have environmental leaders. We want to have innovative environmental leaders from the Afro-descendant communities. part of the work that we are expected to do with Conservation International in the next month, in this process of mapping, is to identify best practices of natural climate solutions, practices that are able to be, replicated in other similar territories, but which has a component of innovation. It's not easy to find best practices of natural climate solutions in communities that have many challenges in terms of socioeconomic opportunities and conditions, but we definitely have very creative people in those challenging scenarios creating innovative solutions. So mapping, one of them is this, and part of the contribution from the vision of the MIT SI is how to combine technological capacities to elevate the efforts of those local communities. So we are in the period to identify those best practices, to define in a more deep way how to combine technological capacity to support those communities.